Imagine a single moment that could unravel everything you thought you knew about yourself. A moment where the world stops, and someone you dismissed as ordinary reveals a gift so profound it shakes your soul. That's what happened one autumn evening in a grand Chicago concert hall, where golden chandeliers cast their glow on polished marble floors. A night meant for celebration turned into a lesson no one would forget. Daniel Harper, a celebrated pianist, stood ready to dazzle an elite crowd. But fate had other plans, and they came in the form of Emma, a quiet staff member who'd spent years invisible. When Daniel singled her out, expecting to humiliate her, he had no idea he was about to witness a miracle. Stick around, because what happens next changes everything. The air in the symphony hall buzzed with anticipation. Crystal glasses clinked as Chicago's elite mingled in their finest evening wear. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed business deals, while women in shimmering gowns traded whispers about the night's star, Daniel Harper. At 52, Daniel was a titan of classical music. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, and his silk bow tie sat perfectly knotted. Tonight, he'd perform Chopin's most demanding works, pieces that had cemented his legend. For him, this was routine. Another stage, another ovation, another night of proving his mastery. He adjusted his cufflinks, barely noticing the staff weaving through the crowd. They were shadows to him, part of the backdrop that made his brilliance shine. Among them was Emma Larson, a woman in her early 30s whose plain sweater and gray skirt blended into the scenery. Her blonde hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and her calloused hands moved with quiet efficiency, refilling water glasses and straightening programs. Emma had worked at the hall for 3 years, arriving before dawn to dust velvet seats and polish the grand piano. She loved these evenings not for the glamour, but for the music. It stirred something deep within her, a longing she couldn't name. Sometimes, when the hall was empty, she'd linger by the piano, her fingers brushing the keys, dreaming of a life where she could make them sing. Daniel noticed her once, as she wiped a smudge from the piano's glossy surface. Her touch was careful, almost worshipful, and it amused him. Did she actually think she understood this instrument, this art form that demanded decades of sacrifice? He smirked, turning back to a group of admirers. Such a simple creature, he thought, with no place in his world of sophistication. The idea was laughable. As the audience settled into their seats, the hall hummed with excitement. Daniel's performances were flawless, his interpretations of Chopin revered as untouchable. No one could have predicted that tonight the real story wouldn't be his. The lights dimmed, and Daniel strode onto the stage, his presence commanding silence. His fingers met the keys, and Chopin's Ballade No. 1 poured forth like a river of gold. Each note was precise, each phrase sculpted with the skill of a master. The audience sat spellbound, carried away by his virtuosity. From her spot at the back, Emma closed her eyes, letting the music wrap around her heart. She knew this piece by heart, every swell, every whisper, every storm. In her mind, she saw its story: love, loss, and redemption woven into sound. Her fingers twitched, tracing the melody in the air, a private dance no one noticed. Mrs. Clara Thornton, a prominent donor, leaned toward her companion. Daniel's genius is unmatched, she whispered. No one living can touch Chopin like he does. The crowd agreed, their applause thundering as Daniel finished the ballade. He stood bowed and soaked in their adoration. This was his domain, where he ruled without rival. But as he prepared for his next piece, his gaze landed on Emma again. She stood against the wall, her face alight with something he found irritating: connection. As if she belonged here, as if she could grasp the depth of what he'd just played. The audacity of it sparked an idea. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice smooth as velvet, "I see we have a devoted listener among us tonight." Heads turned, and Emma froze as a spotlight found her. Her cheeks burned under the weight of countless eyes. "You there, the young woman in the gray skirt," he continued, "you seem captivated. Do you play piano?" The question was a blade, sharp and deliberate. Emma's heart pounded. "A little," she stammered, her voice barely reaching the front rows. Daniel's smile widened, predatory. "A little. How charming. Why don't you share your talent with us?" The audience tittered, sensing the game. They expected a stumble, a moment of amusement before Daniel reclaimed the stage. Emma's mind raced. She was no one, just a worker who mopped floors and dreamed in silence. But Daniel's challenge wasn't just a question, it was a dare to prove her place. "Oh, I couldn't," she said, stepping back. "I'm just staff." "Nonsense," Daniel cut in, his tone dripping with false warmth. "Music is for everyone. Surely you won't disappoint our generous patrons." The trap was perfect. Refuse and she'd seem ungrateful. Play, and she'd face certain ridicule. Whispers spread through the crowd, some guests uneasy, others eager for the spectacle. Mrs. Thornton raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Daniel gestured grandly toward the piano. Come now, what's the worst that could happen? You've been listening so closely. Perhaps you've learned something. His words drew more laughter, but Emma felt a shift inside her. A memory surfaced. Her mother's voice, soft and steady. Emma, some moments are yours to claim. She took a breath, her flats clicking on the marble as she walked toward the stage. The hall fell silent, every step echoing like a heartbeat. Daniel clapped, his voice mocking. Our brave volunteer! What will you play? Perhaps a nursery rhyme. The crowd chuckled, but Emma reached the piano and touched its polished edge, her trembling hand steadying. Actually, she said, her voice clear now, I'd like to try Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Daniel's laugh faltered, his confidence cracking. The Ballade, my dear, that's a beast of a piece. It demands years of— I know what it demands, Emma said. Sitting at the bench, her fingers found the keys, and for the first time that night, she felt at home. The audience held its breath, some cringing, others curious. Daniel stepped back, arms crossed, ready to savor her failure. But as Emma closed her eyes and began to play, the world he knew started to unravel. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 rang out, clear and deliberate, slicing through the heavy silence of the Chicago Symphony Hall. Emma's fingers moved with a certainty that stunned the room. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur or the hesitant touch of someone out of their depth. Her playing carried weight, a depth that seemed to pull the golden light from the chandeliers and weave it into sound. Each phrase unfolded with precision, yet it breathed with a life Daniel's performance had only hinted at. The audience, poised for a spectacle, found themselves caught in something far greater, a revelation. Emma wasn't just playing. She was speaking, her soul laid bare through the piano's voice. Daniel stood frozen, his smirk dissolving into something unreadable. He'd expected mistakes, a quick surrender, maybe a sheepish laugh as she fled the stage. But this was impossible. Her hands danced through the ballade's opening, navigating its shifting moods with an ease that rivaled his own. No, it surpassed him. Where his performance had been a showcase of skill, Emma's was a story. Love bloomed in the delicate passages, heartbreak bled through the minor chords, and hope flickered in the rising arpeggios. The music felt alive, as if the piano itself had chosen her to tell its truth. Mrs. Clara Thornton, seated in the third row, clutched her program, her lips parted. She'd heard this piece countless times, but never like this. It was as if Emma had peeled back the notes to reveal something raw, something human. Around her, the audience leaned forward, their earlier amusement replaced by awe. A businessman in a tailored suit blinked rapidly, his eyes glistening. A young woman in a sapphire gown pressed a hand to her chest, caught in the swell of emotion. The hall, once a place of polite appreciation, had become a sanctuary where every note carried weight. Emma's fingers moved into the ballade's treacherous middle section, where rapid scales and intricate harmonies could trip even seasoned pianists. Daniel braced himself, waiting for the inevitable stumble. It never came. Her hands flowed like water, each note crisp yet fluid, as if she'd lived inside this music for years. But it wasn't just her technique that unnerved him. It was the honesty in her playing. She didn't perform for applause or validation. She played because the music demanded it, because it was part of her. Every crescendo felt like a confession, every pause a moment of vulnerability. In her mind, Emma was no longer in the hall. She was in her tiny apartment, practicing on a second-hand keyboard with keys that stuck. She was 10 years old, sitting beside her mother at an old upright piano, learning the ballade's opening chords. You feel it here, her mother had said, touching her heart. Let it tell your story. Those lessons had been her refuge through years of loss and struggle, a thread connecting her to a woman who'd believed in her when no one else did. Now, as she played, that thread became a lifeline, pulling her through the fear and judgment of the moment. Daniel's arms, still crossed, tightened against his chest. He wanted to dismiss her, to chalk this up to luck or some parlor trick. But the music wouldn't let him. It forced him to listen, to hear the nuances he'd overlooked in his own performance. Emma brought out inner voices in the melody, subtle lines that added layers of color he'd never considered. How had she found those? Where had she learned to phrase like that? The questions gnawed at him, each one chipping away at the pedestal he'd built for himself. The ballade's climactic section loomed, a storm of chords and passion that tested even the greatest pianists. Emma leaned into it, her whole body moving with the music. Her shoulders swayed, Her fingers struck the keys with fierce tenderness. The piano sang under her touch, its voice fuller, richer, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Tears traced down her cheeks, but she didn't falter. If anything, the emotion sharpened her focus, giving the music a rawness that pierced the audience's hearts. A woman in the back row covered her mouth, stifling a sob. A man beside her reached for his wife's hand, their fingers intertwining. Daniel's throat tightened. He was a spectator now, no longer the master of the stage. Emma's playing challenged everything he'd believed about talent, about who deserved to stand in this hall. She wasn't just good. She was extraordinary. The realization hit him like a cold wave, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Not about her, but about himself. Had he ever played with such truth? Had he ever bared his soul like this? Or had he been hiding behind technique all along? As Emma reached the ballade's final passage, her playing took on a luminous quality. The melody softened, each note floating like a sigh. Chopin's genius shone through, but it was Emma's heart that made it unforgettable. The sadness in the music felt personal, as if she were sharing a piece of her own story. Dreams buried, struggles endured, hope reclaimed. The audience sat in absolute stillness, afraid to break the spell. Even the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed to pause, honoring the moment. The last chord lingered, its echo filling the hall. No one moved. The silence was so deep it felt sacred, a collective holding of breath. Then, slowly, Mrs. Thornton rose, her hands coming together in a clap that shattered the quiet. Others followed, their applause building into a roar that shook the walls. It wasn't the polite ovation Daniel was used to. This was something fiercer, a celebration of something rare and true. Emma sat at the bench, her hands resting on the keys, overwhelmed. She'd never played for anyone but herself, never imagined her music could move a room like this. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a humbling awareness. Extraordinary, he said, his voice low, almost to himself. Emma looked up, her eyes still wet. She didn't speak, but her gaze held no anger, only quiet strength. The applause continued, a wave of gratitude for the gift she'd given. For the first time, Daniel saw her not as staff, not as a pawn in his game, but as an artist. And in that moment, he knew the night was no longer his. It belonged to her. Emma's final note still echoed in the Chicago Symphony Hall, but her mind was already slipping backward, pulling her into memories she'd long kept buried. The applause thundered around her, a sound so foreign it felt like it belonged to someone else. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling on the keys, as fragments of her past surfaced like bubbles in still water. The audience saw a woman who'd just redefined Chopin, but they didn't know the cost of those notes, the years of quiet sacrifice that had brought her to this moment. Daniel, standing nearby, felt the weight of his own misjudgment, his earlier smugness crumbling as he began to wonder who this woman really was. She was 9 years old again, in a cramped Chicago apartment where the radiator hissed more than it warmed. Her mother, Lily, sat beside her at a battered upright piano, its varnish chipped but its sound true. Lily's fingers, worn from long shifts at the diner, guided Emma's small hands through Chopin's simpler preludes. "This is your heart speaking, Emma," she'd say, her voice soft but firm. "Let the music carry what words can't." Those evenings were magic, the only hours when the world felt kind. Emma learned to pour her fears, her father's absence, the bills piling up, into the keys, turning chaos into something beautiful. But beauty couldn't stop time. When Emma was 12, Lily got sick. The cough started small, then grew into something that stole her breath and her strength. Hospital visits replaced piano lessons. The upright sat silent, a ghost in their living room. Emma took odd jobs after school, delivering newspapers, scrubbing dishes, to help pay for medicine. Lily fought for 2 years, but the cancer won. The day she passed, Emma sat by her hospital bed, holding her hand. "You're stronger than you know," Lily whispered. "Promise me you'll keep playing." Emma nodded, but the promise felt like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. After the funeral, the apartment was sold to cover debts. The piano went with it. Emma, just 14, moved in with an aunt who meant well but had little to spare. Music became a memory, something to dream about while she worked to survive. She got a job at 16, cleaning offices downtown, her hands growing calloused from mops and bleach. But late at night, in the quiet of her tiny room, she'd listen to Chopin on a borrowed library CD player, her fingers tracing invisible keys on her bedspread. The music kept her mother close, a tether to the girl she'd been. When she was 20, Emma saved enough to buy a cheap keyboard from a pawn shop. It was no concert grand, but it was hers. She taught herself, piecing together what she remembered from Lily's lessons. The Ballade No. 1 became her obsession. She'd play it in her head during long bus rides to work, imagining every chord, every shift in tempo. At home, she'd practice until her fingers ached, the notes a bridge between her past and a future she didn't dare hope for. Music was her secret, a flame she kept alive in the dark. 3 years ago, she'd landed the job at Symphony Hall. It was just cleaning at first, polishing banisters, vacuuming carpets. But it brought her closer to the music she loved. She'd linger after hours, watching rehearsals, memorizing the way pianists moved. Sometimes, when the hall was empty, she'd sit at the grand piano and play a single chord, letting its resonance fill the silence. She never dared more, afraid of being caught, afraid of dreaming too big. Her life was small, steady, invisible, until tonight. In the hall, the applause began to fade, but the audience remained standing, their faces a mix of wonder and disbelief. Clara Thornton wiped a tear from her cheek, her usual composure shaken. She'd funded this venue for decades, but she'd never felt music like this. So unguarded, so true. Others whispered to their neighbors, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. A staff worker, someone they'd passed 100 times without a glance, had just outshone the great Daniel Harper. The air crackled with a new energy, a shared realization that something sacred had happened. Daniel's mind churned. He'd spent his career chasing perfection, building a name that opened doors and filled seats. Every performance was a brick in the wall of his legacy, each note proof of his superiority. But Emma's playing had exposed a crack in that wall. Her music wasn't about ego or acclaim. It was about feeling. He envied that freedom, even as it unsettled him. Who was she? Where had she come from? The questions burned, but beneath them was something sharper. Guilt. He'd meant to break her, to remind her of her place. Instead, she'd shown him his own limits. Emma's eyes opened, pulling her back to the present. The piano gleamed under the stage lights, its keys warm from her touch. She felt exposed, as if the music had stripped her bare. Every note had carried a piece of her story, her mother's love, her years of loss, her quiet resilience. She hadn't played to prove anything. She'd played because the music was her truth, and Daniel's challenge had given her no choice but to share it. Now, with the crowd watching, she felt both powerful and fragile, a woman standing at the edge of a world she'd never meant to enter. Daniel took a step closer, his polished shoes silent on the stage. He wanted to speak, to say something that would reclaim his authority, but the words wouldn't come. Her performance had shifted the ground beneath him. He saw her hands, rough, practical, nothing like his own manicured fingers, and realized they'd told a story his never could. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because she'd bested him, but because she'd reminded him of what music was supposed to be. The audience's ovation softened, but their eyes stayed on Emma. They weren't just clapping for her skill. They were honoring her courage, her ability to transform a cruel setup into something transcendent. A man in the balcony, who'd come expecting a routine concert, thought of his own dreams abandoned for a desk job. A woman near the front wondered about the barista she saw every morning, what gifts might hide behind her tired smile. Emma's music had done more than entertain. It had opened their hearts, making them question who they overlooked, what stories they'd never bothered to hear. Emma stood, her legs unsteady. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but so did a spark of something new, pride. She kept her promise to her mother, not just by playing, but by letting the music speak. Daniel's gaze met hers, and for a moment, she saw something unexpected. Vulnerability. He wasn't the untouchable star anymore. He was just a man grappling with the truth she'd laid bare. And in that shared silence, Emma knew this night wasn't just about her. It was about what happened when the world made room for the unseen to shine. The Chicago Symphony Hall pulsed with the afterglow of Emma's performance, the air thick with unspoken questions. She stood by the piano, her hand still resting on its polished edge, as the audience's applause softened into a reverent hum. Their eyes, once curious or amused, now held something deeper. Respect, wonder, maybe even gratitude. Emma's music had cracked open their world, revealing beauty where they'd least expected it. But for Daniel, the moment was a mirror, forcing him to face the arrogance he'd worn like a second skin. He stood a few steps away, his usual eloquence gone, replaced by a gnawing need to make things right. Emma's gaze drifted over the crowd, her heart racing. She'd poured everything into those notes, her pain, her dreams, her mother's memory, and now she felt exposed, like a book left open for strangers to read. The stage lights burned hot, but the piano anchored her, its familiar weight a reminder of why she'd stepped forward. She hadn't played to win or to shame Daniel. She'd played because the music was her truth, and for one fleeting moment, she'd let it breathe. But what came next? The thought tightened her chest. Would she slip back into the shadows, just another worker in a gray skirt? Daniel cleared his throat, his polished shoes clicking as he moved closer. The audience hushed, sensing a shift. He looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw the woman he dismissed as insignificant. Her calloused hands, her quiet strength, the way her eyes held both fear and defiance. It all challenged the tidy hierarchy he'd built his life around. He'd spent decades in halls like this, chasing applause, measuring his worth by the seats he filled. But Emma's performance had shown him something he'd forgotten. Music wasn't about power. It was about connection, about giving voice to what lived in the heart. I was wrong, he said, his voice low but clear, carrying to the back of the hall. What I did tonight was cruel, and I'm sorry. The words felt foreign, heavy with a humility he hadn't tasted in years. The audience stirred, some nodding, others exchanging glances. Mrs. Clara Thornton, her pearls glinting in the light, leaned forward, her expression soft but expectant. Daniel's apology wasn't enough. Not yet, he knew it, and so did Emma. She met his gaze, her face unreadable, but she didn't speak. Her silence wasn't anger. It was a question waiting for him to answer. You have a gift, he continued, and it's one this hall deserves to hear again. Would you play for us? For the rest of the program. The request hung in the air, raw and unguarded. It wasn't just an offer, it was a surrender, an admission that she belonged here as much as he did. The crowd murmured, some clapping softly, others calling out, "Please, play," a woman in a velvet dress said from the fifth row. "We want to hear you," added a man near the aisle. The energy in the room shifted, no longer a spectacle but a shared hope, a chance to witness something true. Emma's breath caught. Play again. The idea felt impossible, like stepping into a life that wasn't hers. She thought of her mother, of the promise she'd made to keep playing, no matter what. But this wasn't her small apartment, her pawn shop keyboard. This was a stage where legends were made, and every eye was on her. Fear clawed at her, whispering that she didn't belong, that one performance was a fluke. Yet beneath the fear was something stronger. A spark of courage fanned by the music she'd just played. She glanced at the piano, its keys gleaming like an invitation. Maybe this was her moment, the one her mother had always believed in. I don't know if I can, she said, her voice soft but steady. I've never played for anyone like this before. Daniel nodded, his usual polish replaced by something genuine. You already have, he said. And you moved us all. Please let us hear you again. His words carried no trace of the mockery from earlier. They were a bridge, fragile but real, built from his regret and her bravery. Mrs. Thornton stood, her hands clasped. We'd be honored, dear, she called out, her voice warm. Others joined in, their encouragement a chorus that drowned out Emma's doubts. She sat back down, her fingers brushing the keys. The crowd settled, their anticipation palpable. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E flat major, a piece that had carried her through countless sleepless nights. Its gentle melody felt like a friend, something safe to hold onto in this unfamiliar world. As she began, the notes flowed soft and clear, like moonlight spilling across a quiet lake. The music wasn't as demanding as the ballade, but it was intimate, each phrase a whisper of sorrow and hope. The audience leaned in, caught in its spell, their breaths sensing with the rhythm of her playing. Daniel stepped back, giving her the stage completely. He watched her hands, the way they moved with both strength and tenderness, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Envy, perhaps, but not the bitter kind. It was the ache of seeing someone live the truth he'd chased, but never quite reached. Her music stripped away pretense, reminding him of the boy he'd been, practicing in a small Ohio town, dreaming of stages like this not for fame, but for love of the sound. When had he lost that? The question stung, but it also stirred something new, a desire to be better, to listen more deeply, to honor what music could do. The nocturne unfolded, its melody weaving a story of resilience. Emma played with her eyes half closed, lost in the music's embrace. She thought of her mother's laughter, her father's absence, the years of scrubbing floors to survive. Each note carried a piece of that journey, transforming pain into something beautiful. The audience felt it too. A retired teacher in the balcony remembered her own lost dreams, wondering if it was too late to try again. A young couple in the front row held hands, moved by the reminder that love could endure through hardship. Emma's music was a mirror, reflecting their own hopes and regrets. As the nocturne neared its end, Emma's playing grew softer, each note a delicate farewell. The final chord lingered, gentle but resolute, and the hall fell silent. Then, like a wave, applause rose again, warm and full. Emma opened her eyes, startled by the sound. She'd forgotten the crowd, forgotten Daniel, forgotten everything but the music. Now, seeing their faces, tear-streaked, smiling, alive, she felt a warmth spread through her. This was what her mother had meant. Music wasn't just for her. It was for sharing, for healing, for connecting souls across a crowded room. Daniel approached, his expression softer now, almost reverent. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was a gift." Emma nodded, unsure what to say. She felt lighter, as if the music had lifted a weight she'd carried too long. The audience kept clapping, some standing, their ovation a testament to the truth she'd shared. Mrs. Thornton dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, already planning to speak to the board about this remarkable woman. For Daniel, the moment was a turning point. He couldn't undo his mistake, but he could choose what came next. And for the first time in years, he wanted to build something that wasn't about him. Emma's nocturne faded into the Chicago Symphony Hall, leaving a stillness that felt alive, as if the music had woven itself into the walls. The audience's applause rolled gently now, a warm tide of appreciation, but Emma barely heard it. She sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her heart caught between triumph and terror. She'd bared her soul twice tonight, first with the ballade, then with the nocturne, and each note had chipped away at the armor she'd built to survive. The stage lights burned brighter than ever, and the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed against her. Could she keep going, or was this moment too big for someone who'd spent her life in the shadows? Inside, a storm raged. Part of her wanted to run, to slip back into the quiet routine of mopping floors and fading into the background. That life was safe, predictable, free of judgment. But another part, the part that had felt the piano sing under her fingers, refused to retreat. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Not with words, but with a melody. The lullaby she'd played when Emma was small, a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move through it. She glanced at the crowd, their faces soft with emotion, and realized they weren't here to judge her. They were here to listen. Daniel watched from the side, his arms no longer crossed in defiance but loose, almost vulnerable. Emma's music had unraveled him, peeling back layers of pride to expose the man beneath. He'd always seen himself as the star, the one who set the standard. But tonight, he was a student, learning from a woman he'd tried to break. Her playing wasn't just skill, it was a mirror, showing him how far he'd drifted from the heart of music. He wanted to speak, to offer something more than his earlier apology, but the moment belonged to her. All he could do was witness and hope she'd choose to stay. The audience settled their applause, giving way to an expectant hush. Mrs. Clara Thornton, her eyes still bright with tears, nodded encouragingly from her seat. Others leaned forward, their programs forgotten, drawn to the quiet strength in Emma's posture. They sensed her hesitation, but they also felt her power. She wasn't a spectacle anymore. She was one of them, a woman who'd faced fear and turned it into art. A man in a gray suit, who'd come to network with Chicago's elite, found himself thinking of his daughter, wondering if he'd ever truly seen her dreams. A young pianist in the balcony gripped her hands, inspired to practice harder, to play with more heart. Emma's fingers brushed the keys, grounding her. She thought of her years alone, practicing in the dark, believing her music would never see light. Those nights had built her note by note into someone who could sit here now. But the stage was different. It demanded more than skill. It demanded trust in herself and in the people listening. Could she give that? The question hung heavy, but then she remembered the nocturne, how it had felt to share her sorrow and hope. The audience hadn't turned away. They'd leaned closer, as if her story was theirs too. One more, she whispered to herself, her voice too soft for anyone to hear. She chose Chopin's waltz in C-sharp minor, a piece that danced between joy and longing, much like her heart in this moment. As she began, the notes sparkled, light but poignant, filling the hall with a new energy. The waltz was less grand than the ballade, less intimate than the nocturne, but it carried a quiet defiance, a refusal to be small. Emma's hands moved with grace, her body swaying slightly, as if the music were carrying her forward. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. The audience felt the shift. The waltz wasn't just beautiful, it was alive, a celebration of resilience. A woman in a red scarf, who'd lost her husband the year before, smiled for the first time in months, caught in the music's gentle uplift. A teenager, dragged here by his parents, sat up straighter, realizing art could be more than boring recitals. Emma's playing spoke to them all, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. She wasn't hiding her struggle or her strength, and that rawness made them see themselves more clearly. Daniel's chest tightened as he listened. He'd played this waltz before, but never like this, never with such unguarded feeling. Emma made the music breathe, turning a familiar piece into something new. He thought of his own career, the countless hours spent polishing every phrase to impress critics and donors. When had he last played for himself, for the sheer love of it? The question stung, but it also sparked a quiet resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor this moment by supporting her, by making space for the talent he'd almost crushed. Emma's waltz reached its middle section, where the melody darkened, hinting at loss. Her fingers slowed, each note deliberate, carrying the weight of her own hardships, her mother's death, the years of scraping by, the dreams she'd buried to survive. But as the music brightened again, she leaned into its hope, letting it lift her. The audience followed, their breaths catching as the waltz danced toward its close. They saw her not as a worker or a surprise, but as an artist, someone who'd earned this stage through grit and heart. As the final notes rang out, clear and bittersweet, the hall erupted once more. The applause was fierce, not just for the music but for the woman who dared to claim it. Emma stood, her legs steadier now, and faced the crowd. Their faces weren't intimidating anymore. They were mirrors reflecting the courage she'd found within herself. Mrs. Thornton clapped hardest, already imagining the scholarships and opportunities she'd push for after tonight. Others shouted bravo, their voices a chorus of belief in her gift. Daniel approached, his expression open, almost tender. "You've changed this room." He said his words meant only for her. "You've changed me." Emma nodded, a small smile breaking through. "I didn't expect this," she said. "I just wanted to play." Her honesty disarmed him, reminding him why her music had shaken the hall. It wasn't about ego, it was about truth. He stepped back, gesturing for her to take the spotlight, and for the first time, he felt no need to compete. Her light didn't dim his, it made the world brighter. The audience kept clapping, some wiping tears, others whispering about the miracle they'd witnessed. They weren't just moved, they were transformed, reminded that talent could bloom anywhere, that courage could rewrite any story. Emma felt it too, a warmth spreading through her. She'd spent so long hiding, believing her place was in the margins. But tonight, she'd stepped into the center, and the world had made room. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was quieter now, drowned out by the music and the belief she saw in every face. This stage, this moment, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something she was finally ready to claim. 6 months had passed since Emma's unexpected triumph shook the Chicago Symphony Hall, but the echo of that night lingered in every heart it touched. Tonight, the same marble floors gleamed under the golden chandeliers, but the air felt different, electric, alive with possibility. Emma stood backstage, her hands no longer calloused from cleaning, but trembling with a new kind of weight. She wore a simple navy gown, elegant yet understated, a reflection of the woman she'd always been. Her name was printed on the program in crisp letters, Emma Larson, pianist. This was her debut recital, a moment she'd never dared imagine. The hall was sold out, packed with faces eager to hear the woman who'd turned a cruel jest into a legend. Emma peeked through the curtain, her breath catching at the sea of people. They weren't here for spectacle or gossip. They came for her music, for the raw emotion that had moved them months ago. She thought of her mother, Lily, and the promise she'd made to keep playing. That promise had carried her through years of hardship, through nights when hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Now, it had brought her here, to a stage where her dreams could finally breathe. But doubt still whispered, was she ready? Could she live up to the magic of that first night? Daniel waited nearby, no longer the towering figure of that fateful evening. He'd changed, softened by the lesson Emma's music had taught him. He wore a plain black suit tonight, his role not as star but as page turner, a quiet gesture of respect. He'd spent the last 6 months building something new, a scholarship fund for undiscovered talent, named after Emma's mother. It was his way of atoning, of ensuring others like her wouldn't be overlooked. He caught her eye and smiled, a warmth in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," Emma admitted. "But I'm here." "That's enough," he said. "You're enough." The lights dimmed and Emma stepped onto the stage. The audience erupted, their applause a wave of belief that steadied her. She sat at the piano, its familiar weight grounding her, and began with Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the piece that had started it all. But tonight, it wasn't about proving herself or defying expectations. It was a celebration, a love letter to her mother, to music, to the girl who'd never stopped dreaming. Her fingers moved with a freedom she hadn't felt before, each note ringing with joy and gratitude. The music danced, wept, and soared, carrying the audience through a story of second chances. Mrs. Clara Thornton sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. She'd pushed for this recital, rallied the board to fund it, and now she saw the result. A woman transformed, a hall transformed. Around her, the audience leaned in, caught in the spell of Emma's playing. A young mother in the balcony thought of her own quiet dreams, wondering if she could still chase them. A retired firefighter, there on a whim, felt a lump in his throat, remembering the risks he'd taken for others. Emma's music wasn't just sound, it was a mirror, reflecting their own struggles and hopes, urging them to see the beauty in their own stories. Halfway through the ballade, Emma's hands found a new layer in the music, a tenderness that hadn't been there 6 months ago. She wasn't playing for approval now. She was playing for herself, for the years she'd spent invisible, for the love that had carried her through loss. The audience felt it, their breaths sensing with her rhythm. A college student in a cheap seat scribbled in her notebook, inspired to write a story about courage. An older man who'd lost his wife to illness closed his eyes, feeling her presence in the melody's ache. Emma's music built bridges, connecting strangers through shared humanity. Daniel turned the pages, his movements careful, almost reverent. He listened, not as a critic, but as a man rediscovering why he'd fallen in love with music. Emma's playing reminded him of his early days, when every note was a discovery, not a performance. He'd spent his career chasing perfection, but she'd shown him that music's true power was in its flaws, its heart. He thought of the scholarship fund, already identifying young talents in Chicago's overlooked corners. This was his legacy now, not applause or headlines, but the chance to lift others as Emma had lifted him. The ballade reached its climax, and Emma leaned into its passion, her whole body alive with the music. The chords thundered, then softened, guiding the audience to a place of quiet resolution. As the final note faded, the hall held its breath, savoring the silence. Then applause exploded, fierce and full, a celebration of Emma's journey and the truth she'd shared. She stood, her eyes wet but her smile bright. This wasn't just her moment. It was theirs, a reminder that dreams could resurface, that courage could rewrite any ending. She played on, moving through a program of Chopin and Debussy, each piece a chapter of her life. The audience followed, laughing at the playful moments, tearing up at the tender ones. They saw her not as a prodigy or a fluke, but as a woman who'd fought for this stage, who'd turned pain into art. When the final piece ended, they rose as one, their ovation shaking the rafters. Emma bowed, her heart full, knowing she'd honored her mother's belief in her. Daniel stepped forward, taking her hand. "You've given us something rare," he said. "Thank you." She nodded, too moved to speak, and let the crowd's love wash over her. The recital ended, but its impact rippled outward. The scholarship fund grew, drawing talent from Chicago's South Side to its suburbs. Mrs. Thornton started a mentorship program inspired by Emma's story. Audience members left changed, vowing to notice the people they passed every day, to listen for the gifts they might carry. Emma's name became a quiet legend, not for fame, but for what she represented, the power of a single moment to change everything. She'd stepped into her light, and in doing so, she'd lit the way for others. Some stories don't end when the music stops. They linger, like a melody you can't shake, urging you to look closer at the world around you. Emma's journey wasn't just about a piano or a stage. It was about the courage to be seen, to claim a space you were told wasn't yours. She reminded us that beauty hides in the quiet corners, in the hands that scrub floors or pour coffee, in the hearts that keep dreaming through loss. Her music asked a question: who are we overlooking? What gifts are waiting for someone to believe in them? As you go back to your life, carry that question with you. Notice the stranger who seems ordinary. Listen to the story they might tell, because sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the places we least expect. And when they do, they change us all. If Emma's story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe. There's more to come. Keep your heart open and let life's surprises find you.